All right. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation and to pay my respects to elders past and present and to any First Nations people listening here with us today. Why won't that work? Here we go. And I think that the wonderful thing about learning and teaching is that we have this great opportunity, and as a community of practice, our fundamental value is to share and to learn from one another. And so I think we are enriched when we do that, and if we also pay attention to the fact that this is something that First Nations people do particularly well and have shown a pathway forward, and if we can lean into a respectful integration of those knowledges, but also more broadly around diversity and equity and inclusion and those types of values. Right, announcements, events. This is our agenda for today. There's just a few highlights that we like to bring your attention to. Then we'll introduce our fabulous guest, Valentine, who's made herself and her expertise available to us for our theme, which is service learning and supporting the development of global citizens, world-ready citizens, as part of what we do in universities. We're going to hear from Valentine, then we're going to have an opportunity to do what we normally do, which is talk and share ideas. We'll do that probably in some small groups or just pairs, do some more sharing, and at the end, of course, we love to do a bit more networking and eating. So there is food available. If you haven't grabbed something, please do so. Oh, if you don't know who I am, I'm Jacqueline McAway, and I'm in the School of Social Science. No, what are we? I don't even know what we are anymore. Society and Culture. That's, yeah, School of Discipline of Sociology. So yes, hello. All right, announcements upcoming. If you are not on the WIL Australia newsletter, get on it. Get on the website, sign up, and you will get emails with their newsletter, and the newsletter will always share with you upcoming events. I've just highlighted a couple here. There is the New South Wales ACT chapter meeting coming up on the 9th of September. I'll share the deck of slides, so the register there is a link that you can go straight to. And then there is a national webinar a little later in September, which Jen Ruskin will be hosting, and that is looking at using CDL, Career Development Learning, for more equitable WIL. So there's some great panellists on that. Again, those are events that if you can't make it, they record them, but you'll only get access to the recording if you've registered. So do that. Other things for the diary that are a bit further out on the calendar are the next WIL COP meeting, probably around the 7th or 8th. And we're still working out what the theme of that might be. And then the WIL Australia conference is in October 2026. Yes, that's a long way out, but it's good to start thinking about, if you want to present, have you got some research already going? Have you got some practice that you've already got going? Go onto the website, have a look, because they have different sorts of ways that you can engage. Sometimes it's a showcase, sometimes it's a full-fledged paper. So, but there's lots of, or what's the other thing? Well, roundtables are another thing. So that's the sort of thing that we can even start thinking about as a community. Is there something that we could take to that kind of event? All right, I think that's enough of housekeeping. I'm going to hand over to Felicity, who's very graciously done the organising of our guest speaker. Thank you, Felicity. Thanks.
Hello, friends, and lovely to see you here today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Valentine Mercuria, who I've known since 2012. We used to work in the post office here many years ago, and we've kept our friendship partly through our love of service learning and also our love of chocolate. And so Valentine, after working at Macquarie, she worked at Western Sydney University as an educational consultant in will and service learning. And then she moved to ACU, where she's the campus dean in Blacktown campus and also senior research fellow. And she's just completed her second PhD, so congratulations. So the second PhD was at Sydney University and looking at the role of universities in supporting or in addressing the refugees situation in Kenya, which is her homeland. And I'm sure it'll be a very interesting read. Also, she has a PhD from Ohio State University, which is looking at public policy and leadership in the education context. So over to you, Valentine. We look forward to your presentation.
Is we still morning, afternoon? Hold on, where we are. Okay, it's afternoon here. It's still morning somewhere. So I'll still say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for hosting this kind of conversation and giving the platform for the sort of reflection that we'll be engaging in today. The second PhD was certainly an act of madness, not recommended under any circumstances. And you certainly don't make these decisions when you have baby brains, because I remember making the decision just around the time my daughter was born. So I attribute all craziness around it to her coming into this world and wiping out my total brain for it. If anyone hears me talking about a third PhD, I hereby give you all permission to restrain me and give me the straight talk about that's not happening. So yeah, it's been a whirlwind of a time, but I just touched your laptop and I know sometimes they go all sort of funky, these technology things. So if it goes off or something, just we'll blame the laptop.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Sounds good. All right, so just a little bit of a background about me before we get into the conversation around service learning. So when I was studying my first doctorate, the paper.
The snaps.
It's responding to the papers. I think, can you all hear me? That's what happened when I touched it. So I'll just step away from it.
I wonder if it's your phone being close to that. Maybe. Yeah.
I honestly don't have any more gadgets.
The microphone or not?
But if you're recording without, do we need it for the recording? Okay. Can someone keep me on time, please? Because I joined Kenya originally, and the contract of time is running.
Do you know what? I think it's that something. It's your fabulous
I'll go
energy.
with that. I'll take that anytime. Knowing fully well that I messed up with something on the other.
How old are you now?
A grand total of 8 years old, putting me on the straight and narrow. So I did the PhD all part-time in between COVID, taking all sorts of breaks, and
I think it's okay again.
it's okay now? Okay. All right, but someone still please keep me on time because I'll keep you here for the next 3 hours or something like that. But I was told 20 minutes. Awesome. Yeah, so with the first doctorate, that's why I focused a lot on service learning. So it was in educational policy and leadership, but specifically looking at service learning. And I had a particular curiosity about it because I'd come from a background of having a business degree, master's in international business, but there was still a missing link into my understanding of the purpose of education. And so coming from that sort of business background, it felt that education had to serve a higher purpose. There was something more to it, and there was something more to it than just the degrees that we study. And so I was curious about that part of it, and then so landed myself in that sort of trajectory around it. And during that time, while conducting research on service learning. So my dissertation was on civic engagement in Kenya and the role of service learning in developing student leadership. And so I got to teach at the Ohio State University in their leadership through community service. And so a lot of what I'll be discussing today is based on that background and exposure of service learning in that context. And then service learning became one of those catchphrases that no matter what time of day you caught me on and you said the word service learning, I would just like brighten up. So I could be in the middle of one of those drudgery kind of meetings, but if anyone in the room said service learning, then all of a sudden I was back to it. And so it still remained in the system all along. And so then through the process, I've worked in different universities to develop service learning curricula and work through students teaching service learning. So that's the experience that I bring to this conversation and exploring ways in which we can continue to navigate the space of service learning. So I'll make a presentation, and again, I think I'll just do the up and down keys and slides and everything. But I did attend a presentation the other day, and you can tell how well I was listening because they said that the average attention span of an adult, they may have said 8 or 9 or something around that seconds. So clearly I wasn't listening that well. My attention span had already ended before that point. And so for yours, I'll make the claim that it's a total of 8 seconds, right? Your attention span. So I'll not hold it against you if I see a glazed look on your face. But if there's one thing that you can get in these 8 seconds is what I have strongly held over the period of research and practice, that service learning is higher education's most powerful pedagogical tool for critical engagement in our common humanity. So at this point, you can all shut down now. I'll continue for the next 20 minutes and then switch back on at the end of the conversation. And the reason I believe this is, and I'll get to it on the last part with the reflection piece, is because it holds the sort of capacity to be able to expose, engage, reflect, and act, all in the one basket of messiness that we know life to be. And it's messiness in between whatever it is our educational pursuits are at that point in time and wherever it is that we'll find ourselves in the future navigating. And this is the world that we find our students coming into when they come into higher education, pursuing their different disciplinary options and lenses, but with the same critical question: what's the point of all of this? So I know we've gone through systems and timelines of speaking about, the utilitarian purpose of higher education. We're creating this, and it was a big thing, and well, good thing it came with the funding with it at the point, but it was almost like job ready. But then we've always known that when it comes to the purpose of higher education, it has always been and has always meant much more than the destination of an occupation. And that's where service learning becomes that powerful tool to bring the student into that awareness of their specific disciplinary contribution to the concerns of society in its time. And so when we do talk about preparing citizens, global citizens and citizens of the world, it's a great grand ideal, but that world begins right here in their immediate context, in their present time, navigating in and out of the local and the global. And so through that sort of lens and awareness, then what I'll present today is a sort of streamlined mix of experiences, couple of insights into what I use in some of my classes, but then some just general conceptions around the power of this service learning as a pedagogical tool. So I'll begin by just giving a very broad overview of what I position as the 4 principles of service learning. And with those, the approach that I've used in teaching service learning. So the teaching has primarily been with undergraduate students, but always beginning with that core question, the Socratic one, know thyself, because it's in relation to knowing yourself that you can then understand your relation and proximity with others, no matter how narrow or how broad that scope of interaction is. Then I'll give you just one slide of our photo of what we used to use in one of the service learning units as a very pragmatic tool for the students to begin to explore more so just their thoughts and ideas around their skills. And I think that's one of the things that when we get into a utilitarian mode of higher education, we miss out on that lens of critical self-reflection and positioning in relation to self, others, and your contributions to society. So that's something that needs to be regained and created a platform for within the sort of educational process. And then finally, I'll just give a little framework around how this work of service learning is now extending in my current role at the Australian Catholic University. And I'll frame that around what being a mission-driven institution, the sort of social teaching and social thought that frames the lens through which we act as an institution in preparing students for their lives beyond their academic experience. All right, that's the facade of our campus in Blacktown. So the ACU, where I'm at, is at the Blacktown campus, literally across a train station. And it's a very interesting place because, like with any city and with any mandate of a university, a higher education institution, is that you have to navigate the lived reality and your purposeful intent as a higher ed institution. And so we're always confronted by the sorts of issues and social issues that lend themselves very well to discourse in service learning sort of frameworks. And you're always welcome to come for a cup of tea or coffee or anything that you like. I'll skip through those. Okay, so that's just the general framework. All right, and I don't quite have a sense of time. So what I'll do, I'll give you all a really brief, quick activity. I'll give you a grand total of 60 seconds. And then after that, I'll extend it maybe to 1 minute. Yes, put them out.
That's teach. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. You know, you'll see that maybe we select one boring. For 60 seconds, I want you to tell me how many tigers you can see. So just put the number in the corner of your paper. No matter what. You can mark it if you like. Ten seconds.
What about if you say go?
You can still sample the both. Okay, stop. Now, put on your page how many you found individually, right? Now sit next to somebody else, and for the next 60 seconds, figure out how many tigers between the two of you have. Oh, that was awesome. Yes. Okay, stop. Alrighty. Okay, so give this work of so in that collective comes and they did their individual. Yeah. Well, you're good at saying are 16. What's the highest score called by team? How many did you have? 12? 12? Yeah. What are you all? 16. Oh. You guys are legend. So it says 16, but the recent check I did that apparently and then in previous iterations, some people saw a really low, and then I'll add it to the collection. And so this is some of the work that we used to do with the students. So one of the things that we get to learn from this is the principles, one of the fundamental principles of service learning. It's a collective effort. It starts at the individual level because this is who you are and what you contribute into that space and landscape that you find yourself in. But then beyond that, you broaden your horizon into that navigation of time and space and interaction with others. And what has inevitably been found, I'm yet to find a team that after the collective effort comes, lowers their score or something like that. So, but anything is possible in this day and age and in this world. But what it shows you is the power of that collective, the power of that collaboration, the power of being able to see through the lens of somebody else, even if it's not your primary lens, but appreciating that your lens contributes into that conversation in the first place. And this is something with service learning that, again, starting from the very foundations of it, getting students to learn and understand and deeply embrace that sort of understanding that the sense of self never stands as an independent individual way of being as a solo act, right? It always has to then open up and broaden the scope. And this is where when we begin to talk about service learning and global citizens, again, that global perspective beyond just our thinking about, going to overseas and helping out with X, Y, and Z, it actually brings that back home and back again out into that more global perspective, so to put it. And I think one of the things that we find nowadays, and we'll talk about it a little bit more when you get to the social change model, is that it almost seems to be an art that we're quickly losing about relating to other people, and primarily people who are different from ourselves. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to find that common ground that we then work on to then launch into other spaces. And so in this activity, the common ground is that we were all looking for tigers. Some did find goats, and think that is always going to be now a new one that I can add to the collections of animals in the tigers landscape. But it starts with that common purpose. And I think what we have to do then in that space of teaching using service learning and that pedagogical approach is to constantly reframe and navigate back to the necessity to find common ground, rather than just launching into the deep and just using areas of disagreement and launching off of those. And that becomes a difficult space to navigate because sometimes finding common ground is the hardest thing to do in the first place, but it's instrumental in being able to move into any other space. And so with this sort of activity, again, with students in the classroom, it led us to really recognize and to be attentive and very attuned to the ways in which the art of collaboration is both something almost innate in that sense, because human is an island in that sense, but then it also has to be very intentional. So in terms of who do you reach out to, where do you reach out to, and who then do you get to work with? So when we then look at the basic principle of what I like to sum them up in service learning is that, again, being the sort of tool that it is, it's framed within an academic framework. And this is what distinguishes it from pure volunteering or other forms of community service that individuals can do outside of the higher ed context. And therefore, what makes it powerful is that it is embedded within an academic framework that then uses that platform to engage the students into understanding what the role and contribution of their discipline is to our societal problems. And service learning also, done well, done right, and expanded, creates a sort of platform where we begin to see the need to work within and across disciplines to address those common issues that afflict society in general. So another principle of service learning is the scope for critical reflection. This is like an absolute bare minimum basic part of service learning. So any engagement in activities that quote unquote do good in and of themselves with all the virtue that comes with that, they get extended when you involve the level of critical thinking and critical reflection that goes into the models of service learning. And this is because it calls you to critically reflect on those experiences, their implications, both to yourselves, to those you serve, and to community in general. And so the critical reflection piece, and this is where we see between the different assessment tasks and the headaches that go behind creating service learning assessments. It's one of those things that there'll always be some teeth that you're pulling out of our mouth trying to get some of those assessment pieces correctly, but at the heart of it lies that critical reflection. Another principle is, of course, the community engagement piece, that it's authentic and it's collaborative, and that there's mutual benefit and reciprocity that is built into it as a very foundation. And that's a common goal and identification of the commonalities that enable service learning to extend. So as I mentioned previously, the basic framework that then I would work with the students is exploring the whole sense of leadership for the common good. And usually leadership is one of those very interesting sort of constructs. You know, some think it's a power struggle sort of scenario, but then we would look at it particularly because it's using the service learning framework as defined by the leadership being an act of service. And by using that lens, the whole hierarchy around who's who and who does what begins to flatten, because it begins to realize the sources of soft power, innate power, and other forms of power that come with the different parts of the people who are contributing into this common goal. And again, so that's where, again, with the tigers and the goat, you get to see that people will see things differently, and therefore people bring in different perspectives, different strengths. And the art of it is being able to recognize your own and those of others and using those to work towards a common good. And for some reason, my phone is telling me about some time somewhere else. So am I still good to go with it? All right. So what I'd often do with these considerations of leadership is it gave us a lot of platform to use all sorts of psychometric tests, but used with a grain of salt and used with extreme care. Because sometimes people lock themselves into what the psychometric test says that they are, right? But at the same time, there would be an indicator of where your personal preferences lie, like the Myers-Briggs and that sort of thing. One of the ones I also used to enjoy using with them is the Johari window. And so that's one where you reflect on what you know about yourself, what others know about you, what no one knows about you, including yourself. You don't know that about yourself. And then there's the fourth quadrant, which is what I haven't mentioned in the other three. But generally, it would ask you to look at yourself in relation to what you know, what others know, and what remains unknown, which maybe will always remain unknown. But again, with the psychometric test, one of my favorite ones, which is clearly not scientific based or anything like that, so don't read too much into it, was the chocolate personality test. And so you have like a whole box of my favorites, and you just ask everyone, grab a chocolate, but don't eat it yet. Then you look around and chose mint. I know what kind of a person you are. There's a dark chocolate. White chocolate, we kind of gave it a little bit of a tick, but we knew it was never really chocolate or chocolate. So yeah, you can only use psychometric tests to a certain point. Beyond that, just use the chocolate, right? But what these do though is they enable students to reflect deeper on themselves and deeper on that awareness of their personhood, right? And in the process of that is that awareness of the otherness of those that you will interact with, again, both locally and globally. And then so the model for social change, I'll come into it in one of the last slides, but that was always a model because it looks at the individual, the group, and the societal levels of interactions and values. So it was always a valuable instrument for that. Then now in the work that I'm doing with the Australian Catholic University, some of it is framed around what we look at as the Catholic social thought. And usually this has to come with a disclaimer that while it is framed in that way and in that context, it is not exclusive. And we'll get to see the principles and you'll see why they are not exclusive to the CST model, but are more broadly humanistic in relation to how we interact in society. So this one I'll just glimpse through really quickly. So that was one of the very pragmatic ones that I think probably around week 3 that I'll get the students to complete, because by that point they've gone out into their community, the organizations where they're doing their community engagement piece, and then beginning to navigate that space. So again, the unit was leadership through community service. And it was always an interesting one, depending on which was the majority discipline that took the unit. So it was open to all students. We mostly had education students, but every now and then we'd also get the School of Business students. And I always laugh at that because I remember with my background, my business background, it's, on day one, you have all these people coming in to save the world. We are business students, and there's anyone in business here, please forgive me, but you know I'm speaking the truth, right? And so what was interesting with the students was at that point when we were beginning the whole reflection cycle and reflection mode was their understanding of leadership, right? And it was mostly, I'm here to save the world that needs saving kind of story, right? And as we navigated through the system of, wherever they'll do some in schools and, different places where they were doing their community engagement pieces, at one point would almost have like that, cliff, drop sort of scenario where they began to feel helpless because everything they knew of themselves and everything that they brought into the world to save it from itself just didn't work. Why? Because the people that they're working with could care less that you're a business student. They have other issues that they're dealing with. They have other challenges that they're dealing with. And so then you sometimes get the rhetoric that, people, you remain poor because it's a choice, right? So we'd have the whole American meritocracy and that sort of scenario, right? If you work hard, you will succeed. So we would navigate those sorts of concepts and topics. But what's beginning to become clear at that point in time is a sense of deflation at just how big the world's problems are and how small you are in relation to that. And so at that point, we would throw in the quote, I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I can't do everything, I will not refuse to do the one thing that I can. And so then it would reset them into beginning to reflect some more on what that piece that I can do is in the greater scheme of things. And by the time we got done, we had become friends again. But at that middle critical point, you get like all sorts of glares and stares, and no amount of chocolate could pacify that. So I tried to work through it. But again, and this is where the reflection piece becomes really important, because in those moments of deflation, in those moments of the defeatist attitude and mentality about the greatness of life's problems, therein lies an opportunity to reflect more deeply about yourself, your capabilities, and your contributions within that broader framework of things. And so, again, because of the nature of the service learning units generally, you will be looking at different lenses of different social issues, social problems. So one of the things that we have that we work through, so at this Australian Catholic universities, we have the core curriculum and community engagement units, which are compulsory for all students. And one of the things that is often misunderstood is, one, you do not have to be Catholic to attend the Australian Catholic University. You do not have to be a person of faith. It's a place that open to people of faith and no faith at all, right? And so in that space, and when we look at these sort of principles around it, they're principles that speak to humanity from whatever lens you're speaking at it from. what the CST offers is that framework through which then we begin to look at and navigate these spaces in a way that's streamlined enough for you not to need to do the extra bit of it. But at the same time, it's fundamental to everything that we will do or need to think about from the context of a shared and common humanity. And so the principal ones being human dignity and working towards a common good. And this is where, again, the service learning lens provides you with that opportunity to then really critically reflect on not just the issue that you're addressing, but who is involved in the issue and why they're involved in the issue. And one of my favorite ones is the preferential doctrine of the poor, not because of its wording, but because of its mandate to make sure that the decisions that are made taking into account those who will be affected most by them. And that's when we get into the areas of, again, using your discipline lens to look at, one, the contribution of the discipline, but two, where the discipline needs to ask more questions and act more intentionally to change the order of things that are subjecting others to lives of disadvantage, marginalization, and poverty. And so, again, using that sort of framework, looking at subsidiarity, where you don't do for others what they can do for themselves, because that often tends to create a sort of dependent cycle that needs to be broken, right? But at the same time, keeping the space for participation where then everybody can actually participate in the cultural, political, social, economic, religious lives of their society. And then the remaining one, stewardship of creation, global solidarity, promotion of peace, and purpose of universal goods, where, again, these are not restricted to what is taught in the CST model, but it's a very humanistic approach to how we're doing. So even like now, for example, when we look at the state of global affairs, right? And the principle of promotion of peace, right? And this is one of those areas that, again, it has a lens through which, with the social change model, but it's one of those areas that makes us think about that space where we're losing that art of communication amongst ourselves, just cancel culture about anything and everything, no real spaces for dialogue. And when we look at the sort of fragility of peace internationally, it doesn't start too far from home in the first place, right? So, and unfortunately, what often happens, and this is where I'll put my growing up in Kenya sort of hat, is that a lot of times in that context, your present realities, they're very close to you, between that poverty, that lack of material means, and that it's very present. You kind of grow up with it, right? But then because I've lived, I'll call it in the West, which is not politically correct, but in the Western society, right? And this is where the second thesis came through in terms of looking at the refugee higher education. There's a way that we become so desensitized about the plight of other people. And the reason for it is because they're literally a flick of a remote away. And so with this second thesis, I remember in 2016 with the European migration crisis beginning to happen. So there was a whole landscape and flux of refugees. It wasn't a new issue, but where it was happening and how it was happening and how it was reported made it sound like a new issue, made it sound like a much more global issue. It had been an issue well before that. And in the context of Kenya, it had been an issue since as far back as 1992. So it wasn't a new problem. But the only difference was, I remember distinctly watching, it was on CNN, and they were reporting about a Turkish man who had lost his son in the sea as he tried to escape, right? And it's all over CNN and, other media reports. And, it's being reported in that way. But I remember getting to a point where you see it and it's heart-wrenching, but I had the option of turning off the TV. The man had no other option but to carry his son, right? And that level of desensitization is where then a service learning model becomes so powerful because it puts you back in the space of those experiences applied different from what you're experiencing, probably different from anything you will ever experience, but with the same humanity that makes you ask yourself, what can I do about this? And then it's in that framework being supported to then be able to identify, what do I bring to the table? Who else is at this table? Who else can I bring to this table? Because this needs to end regardless. And so with the history of service learning primarily coming from the US model of it and the history it had then like picking up in Australia and in many other places, it becomes that sort of lens that we have to use in higher education to be able to navigate those sorts of social complexities with the minds of people who are inevitably living in these communities and in these societies, who have a mandate to do something, whether they believe they have the mandate or not, but they need to be supported in many ways because it's probably the most foreign experience to them. And this is what we find in navigating it in the classroom. And so then, again, looking at these principles behind it, we realize that there's much more to it than meets the eye. There's much more to it that's more fundamental to all of us in our common humanity. A couple being like 20 or a couple being like 2. All right, so I'll just fly through these ones because they kind of summarize the 9 teachings. So again, so this is always very explicit in ACU's mission and how we live that mission in community and society. So again, based around those 3 primary ones. And so that's the model. So this is one of the models that I used again in the first dissertation. And what I found particularly beneficial about it was that it actually positions all the 3 different layers at which we have to operate in the context of service learning. There has to be an individual sense of values. And this is a part where in higher ed, because of all the ways in which we have gone around curriculum and all the dots we have to, all the I's we have to dot on the I cross the T sort of scenario, you know what I mean with that? It has moved us away from being able to engage much more intentionally in this space where we give students a chance to really reflect on those individual values that they bring into the classroom. But within those, there has to be the element of a consciousness of self and a congruence. But you can't be congruent if you don't know what your values are, which is why you need to know your values, because the areas of friction begin when there's a gap between what your values are and what you're actually exhibiting or living. And often there's no transition point in between. But because of the reflection piece in service learning, it bridges that gap where it asks for that deeper reflection at the individual level, but both at the group and society level. And in the individual level, there has to be that level of commitment. Then there are also the group values, which again, we navigate. We grouped together a couple of tigers and goats. But that sense of collaboration, who am I working with? Who do I need to work with? What's our common purpose? How do we go about it together? And the area of controversy with civility, that was a really interesting one, which was quite unique to this model in that it made us have to discuss controversial issues. Right now, we kind of just walk on eggshells with it, or it's everything's thin nice and you have to, just be very careful, but you're not being authentic. So, but it doesn't mean that you represent it with respect, but that you represent it authentically. We're not having much of that space. And that's a space that we need to create because there will be controversy. We are different. We saw different tigers at different points. But together we saw more tigers and a goat in different times, right? And so that's an area that I think needs to recognize the power it has within service learning to be able to live it to its fullest. And I think also with that one too, was one of the downsides with service learning is it has a sense where, again, going back to one particular year that I had with some of the students, it has a potential to reinforce a stereotype. So if you go and work with a particular community and the particular community continues to exhibit the stereotypes around it, then the student can easily come out and say, I told you, those people are like that. So it hasn't broken any cycle of anything, right? But then again, reflection, critical reflection. Why do you think that? What are you stereotyping it? What is it about that situation? So the modes of reflection. And then the final one being on the societal or community values. And that's a sense of citizenship. So not in terms of your, got your citizenship sort of scenario card, but your actual mandate as a responsible citizen, not just of a nation, but as a global citizen. What is my role? What do I do? How do I make good of who I am and what I can do? And who else can I do that with? And so, yes, so this is one of the models that I hold quite highly. It did my head in when I was using it for my dissertation, but it all came to fruition. And so just my last reflections on service learning itself. Over the years and over time, these are the main reflections that I've had. and going back to your 8 seconds of attention span. So this is the time to wake up now if you had been asleep the whole time. Service learning is a powerful pedagogical tool because it's academic and it has a critical reflection piece in addition to the community engagement piece. It is an instrument of exposure. Many students will be exposed to issues for the first time in that unit. And that is where you get them to that challenge of what do you do about it. Service learning can go rogue, so it can definitely reinforce stereotypes and perpetuate them. And that's where assessment and reflection have to be well designed. It can be an opportunity for career clarification. I had to copy it when one of the business students decided to stop studying business and move into education. Thankfully, I wasn't held accountable for that, but it was the experience that really led the students to see themselves more attuned to the education part of it. It does provide you with opportunities for global exposure, and it's a really good vehicle for bringing conversations on policy and people's lived experiences and actions into the forefront of what we need to do to change things in the scope and the influence where we can actually change things. And I think I'm done with my couple of minutes. Yes. The last slide, that is the messiness of service learning, but at the same time, it's opportunity. And it tells me I have run around for like 2 minutes or something, so my phone's not working on that either. But yes, so thank you very much for your time to listen to the reflections and everything else, but we are thinking of the most powerful tool in higher education. Don't tell them that, but just share it loudly wherever you go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Valentine. It was really engaging, insightful, and I think it's really good how you highlight the nexus between the individual and the global, the systems of the world, and how we all have an individual responsibility to act, but also taking into account the global context and our common humanity. So it's really good, and also the cautionary note you made about the need for critical reflection. I think we'll all remember this tiger activity and what we can learn from that about the need for that sort of collective vision. So thanks very much, Valentine. And over to Jacqueline.
Oh, it's inspiring. Thanks, Valentine. It's not something that I imagine is necessarily easy to do, but I do suspect that some of us are possibly already doing some of this service learning in our work integrated learning work. There are some values there that I recognise, some pedagogical strategies that I'm sure we use in terms of reflection and getting students often to start with self as an important place, whether or not that's helping them to understand who they are as learners, potentially who they wish to be professionally, where they might like to go. So I'm sure in our toolkits, we've got some of these tools already, but it might be worth us spending some time having a bit of a chat, because that's what we like to do in the COP, is talk amongst ourselves about what it is that we're doing, what it is that we think we could do. So I have come up with some questions. They're there. And I did print some out. 2 pairs. Okay. I don't know if I have enough. Take one, pass it on. If not, there's some up there. But if we take a little bit of time, I don't know how much time, 5 minutes, have a chat. Yes. Yeah.
Contribute to society. What is focus? Yeah, it's about all our communities. Science engineering. I was running with house. Yeah, I was thinking more. Yes.
We also went to do this to pay for money to pay for the work.
Yeah.
Have you got the same question? Oh, it's a condition.
Okay. And everything, just kidding. All right. So just the word itself, right? Service and learning, right? So it went through a whole period of navigating between whether they're two separate entities or not. So but the basic premise is the act of service, serving somebody, serving a community, serving something. And because it's within an academic context, and sometimes they had to make that disclaimer and call it academic service learning, is that it has the learning piece as fundamental to that experience in the service. And so it goes back and forth in terms of students learning through how they're serving. And in the process of serving, they are learning about their area. And so we had a question like in the environmental science and environmental area. So you will be navigating around issues to do with the environment, right? But in the process, and this is where the community collaboration comes in, it's instrumental in learning about that because they're the one in the process of living and acting in that field or in that area. And so the wealth of experience that they bring and share with the students becomes a critical learning point for them. And service learning then becomes that sort of framework where you navigate the theory as you know it into the practice as it's actually lived. And so again, this is where the whole reflection piece becomes key. And so like we're saying, with the communities or the local government or the people who are like literally in that space doing that work, they will be the learning partners in that because they will help the student in the whole navigation of understanding what it means to actually do this sort of work. And because if you're coming at it just primarily from a one disciplinary lens, it will be very clear that this is what that link is, but it also exposes the messiness of what the discipline is, what the profession is, who does what when, because it's never linear. And so the learning part of it is where it gains its strength when it's co-designed, where then you work with a community partner to then identify what are some of the things that they want students to know, that they need students to know, because sometimes we have a nice neat package of a graduate with a flashy degree, and then your community partner tells you they have absolutely no clue about anything, but they're very theory heavy. They know their theories well enough, but then reality chucks a whole lot of those theories out because it's a different lived experience. And when they do encounter that, it becomes a platform for them to question that theory, enhance the theory, navigate the theory. And so it continues to be that sort of cycle. So my favorite definition was the one that used the hyphen in between, because it meant that they do not stand as two distinct entities. Because when they stand distinctly, the service part of it you can achieve in any volunteer activity. The learning part of it you can achieve in your classroom in that context. But when you bring them together, it needs that act of service to the community and what you're learning to make greater sense of what you know and what you've learned and how you will contribute. It was a whole number of years of debate, that little hyphen. Yeah.
The service learning itself, could there be two kinds of fields about where you are getting students to actively participate, as you're saying, self and being out in the field? Or would that be also flipped again with this like will piece where you're going the non-profit or community to come to the classroom and talk through the system or the problem and then getting the students to actively work on that? Is that still considered a service learning experience?
Yes and no. Okay, because it's often taken quite like a spectrum of intensity in terms of the actual service, right? So now there's more conversation around project-based, and that would be one of the areas where students can work on a project and life goes on. And then in that particular case, again, looking at the extent to which that's mutually beneficial and reciprocal. So if the community partners are coming in, ways of benefit back to them. And so the principle of service learning requires that it's mutually beneficial and reciprocal. So when it's that, so it is a learning experience, but it misses on the transformational piece, which is again one of the superpowers of service learning. It has to transform you. It has to make you think. It has to make you question. And so if it's just absorption of it, it hasn't met its goal. And so usually that transformation piece comes when you expand that horizon into then working with other people. So if you have, say, like a not-for-profit partner coming, let's say they work in the area of homelessness, just sort of frame it, right? So they can come and talk to your students and tell them about the issue and, you know, really broaden their perspective about it. But they've only walked one step with it. Now, for it to be transformational, the student has to do more, right? And so sometimes you can get, okay, then the student goes to work with, say, one of our community engagement, they work with Parramatta Mission. So Parramatta Mission has a wide range of services that they provide, one of them being a food service, right? Now, students can do that as part of their community engagement piece. So that's a next step, but it's still not complete because it's not enough just to serve somebody a plate of food when they've come to your service, right? So yes, they're probably experiencing homelessness. They're dealing with issues of food insecurity and that sort of thing. The student understands it from your community partner who spoke about it. Now they're in a place where the partner is actually working in the space of addressing that sort of social issue. So it is more than just the initial stage of it, right? But it's still not there yet because we haven't had a conversation with someone who's experiencing homelessness. They do not understand from a lived experience what that could be like. And so then what the partner then comes to do in that sort of learning platform is create an opportunity where the students can have that one-on-one human interaction with another human being whose life's chances have been quite different, but is still a dignified human being like anyone else, regardless of that. And they have to navigate that space. And so then moving it into that level of space is then what creates that transformation. Service learning is a lot of hard work, countless work. Nobody really cares to give you credit for it. But at the same time, the transformation that you see, if it had a dollar value assigned to it, they would certainly pay you much more than you do right now, right? And so what happens in that sort of transformational stage is a student will speak to someone who's experiencing homelessness and will come up with, even if it's one aha moment about somebody else's life, what led to that situation, how that person ended up there. Because that's where, and this is where the whole service learning going rogue has to be really well intentionally designed as an experience, because there's also a very fine line between the student meeting and talking to somebody who's experiencing homelessness and going back and saying, that person doesn't want to be helped, right? Versus, okay, why do we still have homelessness in a country as affluent as Australia, despite what we're saying about the cost of living, right? Why is it? And those are some of the things we navigate in the US, where we had, there's a great book, I can't remember the author, but it's about the invisible poor, where you're talking about a very affluent society, but poverty is so relative that you don't even know what to call it anymore. So there is real poverty, but then when you look at the scale of poverty, it has almost a relative element to it. But being poor in an affluent situation, in an affluent society, is just as bad as being poor in a country that has no resources to spread around its citizens, right? And so navigating that space, but then that experience and that opportunity the student has had to meet a homeless person will probably be the only time they will actually have that opportunity. Yeah. But then beyond that, they can then broaden their horizon. So then you can take it back and talk, okay, what are the sort of policies that we currently have that are perpetuating this situation of the housing crisis, the cost of living, things that are affecting people. You know, you get to meet people who are homeless outside of what we know stereotypes. You know, coming to find out that now there's an increasing number of women over 55 experiencing homelessness because of what their working life structure was like, superannuation. You know, you don't get it when you're on maternity leave. So then you start seeing the cracks in the system, and then the students become part of filling those gaps. And so you move it along that trajectory. So you know, given time, resources, thoughts, and everything else, you can scale it. but then the ultimate is that transformative piece, which the community partner plays in.
University is extremely well positioned, given that we have compulsory pays for all of our students. And so this is extremely valuable and relative and incredible. Like, I wonder how this fits into the curriculum and like what units have the compulsory units where you are doing hours out in the community and what, unit conveners are looking for the NFP partnerships and who are looking for like corporate partnerships. My background's corporate partnerships here, so I can industry into the classroom. And I'd love to be actively out there promoting and looking for those partners in community and volunteer work, or where in that unit, so where does that work internally for us to utilize?
And I think that's the thing. The reality has already been painted for you. You want to reach the ideal, but your reality is very restricted, right? So that just means you work in your reality, right? With always the hope of expanding it, but you start with your reality, because no matter how good your ideals are, if your systems and structures will not work well enough for you to expand, there's only so much you can do, right? But then within those systems and structures is then being able to see how much of those boundaries can you push further. So one of the things I remember during my time here was I don't know if it's still available, staff members could get like a sort of leave period to be able to do that, right? So at ACU, we have the community engagement time release, and you get 35 hours of time release, 35 hours.
2 days.
Yeah, so this is like, they're full on. So when they talk about mission, and it's available to everyone, it's, if you want to use your 5 days of your CTR to work something. And so that's a part of policy that clearly has been thought of and defined to then be able to lead to that outcome. And so it's not always, some places will get it, some won't, some restrictions, but then within those frameworks, then you can be able to see how you can push those boundaries. One of the powerful corporate models I've seen is when working with different corporate organizations, they have an opportunity to work with students in a particular service industry. So for example, we used to take, I think it was ANZ staff and then students from one of the business classes to food bank. And they would
be partnered with ANZ.
Yeah, so you partner. Yes.
Yeah.
And because ANZ has a corporate social responsibility
Yes.
model, you hinge onto that model as well,
Yeah,
right?
utilize
Yes.
the corporates even coming in and
Yeah.
their time and energy to CSR
Yeah.
needs. And yeah, we do again have 2 days each. So it's almost like maybe we won't that into how we want
The tigers.
Yeah, actually there is ways.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of Service Study, is that it is such a broad creative platform. And because it's always restricted by policy in some shape or form, it calls for you to think outside those frameworks. And so the more people you can bring in to see how you're gonna, work with these tigers, then the better it becomes, because those in HR who are responsible for those sorts of policies, if there's a way between a coffee conversation and the need for this sort of thing, something can actually happen, bring them on board, right? But at the same time, you will work within whatever confines you have. So to put it at that point in time, or with your goal of being able to offer that transformative experience.
Actually, that could be a really nice model, tapping into the corporate social responsibility piece. Most organisations have it. They've often got projects that they're running, and to be able to link students, staff, community, and then I think it also helps graduates see that this is an ongoing thing that you do, that you embody, that when you go into your professional life, you continue to do good, both in your day-to-day professional role, but also within this other space as well, and that they're actually related.
Yeah.
You bring those skills and abilities that you have. That would seem a really
Yeah, I think it's actually a powerful model, because then in that process is the personal and professional development from the student, who's then interacting with the staff members at the ENZ.
Yeah.
So that interaction, so they see themselves, they see a professional in the industry they're aspiring to, focusing on social issues. So they know that if they work in a place like ANZ, they have that latitude to extend their profession into some positive social outcomes. And so it becomes just that triangle, like you're saying. And so, you push the envelope for as long as it can be pushed. And again, a lot of those models lend themselves to it. And that level of just the creative genius that service learning allows for helps you navigate those sorts of spaces in terms of what more can we do with this. And you're always looking for that one more, that one extra piece. So yes, this model exists. Companies have CSR, they have to fulfill it in some shape or form. Many of them have money to throw at it. Put up your hand for the money to be thrown in your direction and you put it towards some other good use. And again, bringing like-minded in terms of you're all looking for tigers sort of people to then look at how do we do more with this? How do we do better with this? What can we grow it into?
Are there any conveners in the room that could answer whether you're able to create a volunteer day within the CUP class and promote that actively, like obviously not compulsory, but within your unit by saying this is the project we're working on this year with Food Bank, we're going to go on this night to volunteer. Because that's how I feel like the way that could be promoted would probably have to be the classrooms or I don't know.
And even those small, I mean, I'm just thinking now how we've got this quite broad definition of will now.
Yeah.
Those small little taster things could be involve something like that sort of thing.
Well, I was just thinking about writing a leadership unit for the course, and I'm thinking this is great. I can fit this into there. It's not a placement unit, but this would fit really nicely into and being able to expose students to a different way of thinking. Because when they're on for nursing, it's very nursing hat on, learning skills, learning how to be a nurse. I really liked the emphasis on learning about yourself and learning about others in a way that I think traditional nursing placement really lends itself to it sometimes. So I quite like that idea of maybe fitting it into a little theory-based into learning.
Is it compulsory? Is that how it?
So we do have, so the core and the community engagement units will be compulsory. They are not compulsory in the nursing school, just simply because of the definition of the program. But what our deputy head of school and the team do is they build in a community engagement piece. So I think it's in August, we have Health Week. And so the nursing students go to the library, the local library, to offer free health checks, what they can do at that level. And so they do that. I think it's usually a week long, but they go in depending on their schedules, like that one particular day. So you have your students doing your BP and that sort of thing for whoever comes. And they use the library because that's a space of high human traffic in terms of the community. And so they work at it in that sort of space. And then we have like the nursing club, the nursing society, who then extend it into that sense. So the students then lead the sort of initiatives around that community engagement piece. So they design and do that part of it with the support of the academics, but run specifically from the student association. We did have here at a while back in one of the comms units, it was ICOM, international communications or something like that. So we were trialing a model. So it was the unit, the program itself was communications, international communications. And so they had the content, everything all designed. There was an option for students to opt into a stream of it. And within that stream, they worked with, I can't remember what country the community partners were from, but they were based in the Middle East. And I remember at one point we'd have Zoom called a strange hours. So the students would come in. So the students were working on a marketing campaign for the organization. And remotely, this was pre-COVID time, so they were onto something. And so the partner had the brief of what they're trying to communicate. They had the usual orientations and everything else, and then students would work on it. In between one of the meetings, you could just hear like all the mayhem happening in the background with all sorts of insecurity and everything happening. But the community partners were committed to then working with the students on that. And then the product was the students would, like the remaining ones in the stream, produce that marketing campaign, only that theirs was in a global context and therefore it wasn't. So the outcomes in terms of the learning experience were quite positive on this one. But what we did find was a sense of inequity in terms of the students who couldn't do the international component for some reason, like maybe they were working or something and didn't have the option, the assessment task and that sort of thing. So there's a lot more that went into designing it, but the outcomes were overwhelmingly positive by being able to offer the sort of stream, non-stream option. And again, there were some students who were just not interested in the stream, but then those had to be weighed down. But I think, like you're saying, within the framework, I think the broader thing being understanding the totality of what your boundaries are, milking dry everything within those boundaries while you're trying to figure out how to broaden those boundaries to be able to accommodate more forms of transformative learning. And it's often not an overnight thing, as we know, higher ed institutions, but there's always a possibility. And that's where the partnerships, the collaboration, the core design process really helps a lot, because the partner comes on board in terms of what's required for assessment. And so once they're already on board on that, then it makes things a lot more streamlined in terms of the justification of those activities.
But we do have the power as well to pick and choose the projects and the partners we get to work with. And again, working across faculty and having these levels. I love that idea of, a whole week on focused on health, and that kind of space. We have sustainability is a really large part of what we're doing here. We're partnering with Monica and Altar to do an e-Wednesday that's coming up in 3 weeks' time. We're trying to get involvement from the community and the students who volunteer work. And like as you're talking about all this, with the help of everyone and throughout the university, that could be something big, and maybe it's a big sustainability week from other corporate partners in the park and other NLP. It's still big with that thinking, but I think
It starts there. It starts there, and then you work towards it.
right.
Yeah.
But I think there are things that we are doing in our own units, even thinking about just some of the principles and embedding those into the way that you might design a unit. So the notion of reciprocity, I know, is something that features in my own unit when I select partners and projects, and going, well, we're not doing anything unless there's got to be something in it for them. And you tell us what it is that you need. And most of my partners are NGOs and or council, like local community type stuff. So
Do they get what they need back? Do you think that
mostly,
sometimes I get the back. But the volunteer aspect, I think we really lend to that as well.
Yeah, it's one of those things that sometimes all they need is a bad experience with a student and they shut you down totally. After you've been trying to, and sometimes the student is clearly not a representation of what you stand for as an institution, and you're like,
those ideas to do with like nursing week or health week, even starting to think creatively about those things and what we could do.
And collectively, like you said, you're working on things that like how many of us know about that and how we can connect that into, it's like from other channels. It's really intertwined, which I think also pushes that.
that's the power of this community of practice. Yeah, we have that sort of like-mindedness already in terms of that direction and that goal, and then that experience from wherever different units, disciplines, and everyone is coming from. So yeah, it's a powerful friendship for everything.
As I've been thinking through this, in the Bachelor of Science, we've got 4 units where we're trying to make this into curriculum. But what we've been sort of floundering with is that we're not career specialists, we're not personal development specialists, and perhaps there's a curriculum that's being developed by other people in other areas that we could use as well. I mean, I don't know if there's money created. And the conveners that are running the units, they're chemists, they're physicists, and how to help them with, I don't know, psychiatric things, and more sort of just, like a horoscope, basically. But to find the best practice of helping people reflect and do this. We had the experience of a first year, and I'm thinking about how do you scaffold people into understanding how to civilly talk to each other and take the opposite positions, but still, come to that point. So we had in our first year unit, we used a kin and country approach to Eagle and grandmother, granddaughter, and the reports back from the tutorials was that students were
in the first case, maybe not really thinking very creatively, and then when they met the opposite of their kin, they were quite aggressive, or they couldn't find that kind of place. I think there's a whole lot there around ways of easing people into being able to speak with their mind, but speak it in a respectful way and to find that common ground, which we haven't quite got to with that example, because that was the first time we ran it. But got these core units where there's that chance to help students develop those skills so that they can get this out of them and their capstone. It's all
Also, one of the other areas that are often underused is the alumni network. And I think a lot of times is that proximity because they're alum and they have a sort of edge in terms of that lived experience. And sometimes all it takes, like, we're saying in terms of that overall skill of service learning, it could be this beginning touch points, right? So where you just have something national week or whatever else it is, and then you just have some alumni, and they don't have to be alum if they're, people that you can't quite get to at that point in time. But alum tends to offer that very closer, proximal experience to the student. And then that can be run like as a panel where you ask them solution questions, tell us of a time, in your job when you had to work with somebody who you did not agree with. What did you do? Right. And so they're looking at it through stuff. So it's less tense because it's not my experience, it's somebody else's experience. Because if it was my experience, it would be a fist fight, right? Mm-hmm. And so they begin to tell that part. And I think what I found with that sort of sharing of experience is you always get a nugget from somebody else's experience. And they say you're always better off learning from someone else's experience than from having to do it yourself. So the more you can learn from somebody else's, the more time you have to live your own experiences. And so that could be a way of looking at the sort of support you have within your alumni network. And then also just generally guest speakers and those sorts of things. Again, just low impact in terms of just that introduction to it. The rest can be built, but that can be a platform where it's the personal and professional development can begin to be built in the process. The awareness, yeah. So that exposure. Yeah, you get that exposure piece. So I'll expose you to all things that happen in the workplace. They taught me this in class, and I walked in with my rose-colored glasses into the place. And on day one, I wanted to quit sort of scenario. Thankfully, somebody else has experienced that, and so that it's a possibility, or somebody has been living their life in their profession. And so just being able to offer them those introductory touch points, which then continue. It's more like a scaffold sort of thing. So not all of them will start with this high impact area to begin with, but you can begin where you can begin. And so if you do have, someone who can come in as a guest lecturer, or even in those sort of the ones that can escalate into other situations of conversation. So I think one of the things, like I was saying, is we've lost that art of conversation with people who are diametrically opposed. We don't have the skills for it. We don't know what to do with it, but it's a reality. And we're so in such polar ends of things that it's not even funny, because then any sort of friction in between is just catastrophic. But there are people who know how to facilitate that. And so then you want to see if there's someone in the industry that can do that or does that or the everyday stuff. Yeah, or one of the HR managers in the organization that they work in one of your environmental places, just come and do this one out with our students. And yeah, so I think that you're saying, being able to identify who else can see extra time and how do we want to take advantage of it and how can we work together, because we have that common goal, we have that common purpose, common vision. And then there's a muddy road in between that we have to trudge along together. But you keep your sights on that with the frameworks of everything else in between, but knowing that it's a journey to that level of achievement. And let me know how you go with your next fist fight. Controversies. And that's why with the social model, the controversy with civility is built into that social change model.
Yeah, and I think possibly the exercise can still work. We just need to be very much how we schedule
time for reflection and time for diffusing situations. Yeah, because I find a lot of times it's most of the time, but not so much the approach or anything. Because sometimes, like when things have blown up, the session has ended. It's like, no, no, we needed more time to deal with the explosion before the session ended. So just being able to walk out within.
Can I ask a question? I just want to get confirmation. I'm from Kuala Business School, so Department of Management. So you're talking about no, no, I'm mistaken. We are right. So basically, I'm one of the case student for the national business that we do in your thing. So in order to have variation for the class, we kind of like pretending that we are a consultant for them. So what others like what you do is like NGOs, their console, so like most of the our industry partners from big company, one small one. But I was thinking like I don't really service learning, but I was thinking like is that funny giving like consultation because at least many of your NGOs are dealing with one is refugee from Afghanistan. The other one is giving open education learning in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So there's basically inform them the manager or the CEO from that company so give them like introduction what they're doing and what the challenge. So most of them the challenge about how to compete with the grant funding and so on. So the students can like giving some idea how to compete each other and then how to make it good strategy, business and so on. But is that not enough? So what they have to like directly involve themselves to connect. Okay.
So in the first definition of service learning, it's not there yet.
Yeah.
Because the interaction is with a level of individuals who though working for that common good are not affected in the same way by that common good. Right? And so the CEOs and those the leaders in the organizations are very well aware of what's happening on the ground, right? But then that means that you're that one step removed from the actual situation. So what you're working with is these two levels, right? Now, one of my positions with service learning is that the intention to go the full way still has to be maintained, right? The reality is that you may not be at that point yet. And so you work towards that, right? So for example, in that model, so you work with the organization leaders around the sort of model that you're working on, right? Now they have direct contact and they often use the word client. I'm not particularly keen about the word client, but that's what's commonly used, right? But we're talking about those who use or are affected by the products of this organization, by the decisions of this organization, right? So for example, let's say you're working with, say, like a microfinance company, right? And you're working around, say, maybe like a marketing campaign or something like that. What you're dealing with is a filter response to what they're telling you of the lived reality, right? Now, you can hope at the most that they're extremely accurate about it. But the reality is, if these people who are affected by it are not at the table, you're one perspective less. And so like with the tigers, right? You're seeing tigers, they're seeing tigers, they're telling you what tiger, we have 12 tigers that we're dealing with, right? And that's close enough to accurate, right? But the 4 tigers that they haven't seen would be tigers that somebody else would have seen had they been at the tigers. And so then what you can do with that sort of model is to then open up a platform for that direct engagement. Again, recognizing that not everybody who represented will necessarily represent all views. But again, that's where with training, like, okay, I need all views. You don't have to agree with them. I just need you to represent what the views are on the ground, right? So you won't have all of their clients come into the meeting, right? But they can then figure out which clients to then expose you to who would then be able to represent what happened in the client base. But even within that, you take it with a grain of salt because it's still a filtered perspective. So the person they choose to represent these other people has a particular lens. So for the fact that this person was chosen by them, you will not discredit it, but at the same time, it still feels correct. Now, if you have an opportunity, for example, you hit a brand where you can take your students to the place to speak with the client in the process of learning. So they'll speak with the client and they'll speak with the leaders of the organization. Then they can come up to a more objective perspective and then you bring back into it. So of course you need to win the lottery to get your students overseas in the first place, right? But it's not impossible. And so that might be then the lens that you start thinking, how do we extend, right? So I think the position with it is that there'll always be more to do, right? And which is where we found that with the students, that sense of despondency when you hit that point, because there's just too much. Like there's so much more, it drives you crazy, right? But the reality is that even within all the possibilities, your reality will only let you pursue a certain number of them. But then that's where then you bring in more people who see either, because your capacity may be reached at this point, which is the beginning point of somebody else's capacity. And so they can run into the next thing, but you need to then bring them on board. So you have to be very intentional about the inclusion piece, but also intentional where you also bring in people who have very divergent views, because sometimes we get into the group think mode. So they'll probably pick somebody who can speak good things or tell you good things and support them for free. But then the one person who's contesting something, they don't want you to touch with a textbook before
Goat.
see the goat, right? So you don't want the person seeing the goat because you've asked them to look for tigers. But the fact that somebody else sees a goat means there's something else you should be paying attention to. So now you know there's a goat. I know there's a rhino. In the next time I do it, I don't know what an animal will come up with. But those are the people. So your outliers are also those within the peripheries need to be part of that conversation. So that goes back to the principle that happened in social court about that subsidiarity and participation. Everyone has the dignity and the right to participate in matters that happen, and they need to be able to do that. And so then that's what you can extend your model into, even if right now it doesn't have that capacity, but you have some sort of leanings towards where people.
Thank you.
And I do that with business students, because that's what, and you say, well, we can do so.
Well, in typical COP fashion, we don't, which is great. It is 1:30, so time has gone away from us. A really terrific conversation. People, I think, have seen lots of people nodding their heads, and I think, to your point, there is a collective commitment in the room for us to understand and enact what we understand fundamentally, the value of university education. It's yes, we want our students to get jobs, but we also want them to leave the world leave this place into the world in a place where they can contribute in meaningful ways, and bring their talents and values and gifts to their community. So thank you for inspiring us, sharing tips and tools and ideas, some really, really practical things that we can use to even start a conversation, and also to think really critically about our own practice and what are those small things that we can start doing, and build on, keep the conversation going. So thank you very much. We know you like them. I don't. That's a Thank you, and thank you, everybody. Again, everybody's always generous with their sharing their questions and knowledge. Thank you.
I just tried to join people standing. It says another form which is